When it comes to a Pokemon game, players tend to have a wide variety of different desires, whether it be a good story, good graphics, or even having all 9 generations of features or Pokemon available. But most of the time, they usually just want it to be playable until the end. So in this video, I'll be taking a look at 5 Pokemon fan games that I believe are all worth playing in 2025. They all have completed main stories and a plethora of features that make them friendly to new and casual players, while some still retain an ounce of difficulty for the more hardcore ones. But make sure you subscribe to never miss out on the latest and greatest Pokemon fan games and ROM hacks. So without further ado, let's get right into the games. Before we continue, I'd like to take a moment to talk about a monster taming game called Dokimon that just so happens to be the sponsor of today's video. In this game, you'll travel through a huge world with over 15 towns, catching over 140 original and unique monsters, and a story with around 20 hours of content. It has a beautiful art style that both resembles the older Pokemon games, but also has a more modern feel to it. But unlike the older Pokemon games, Dokimon comes with a plethora of quality of life features, such as a battle speed up button, free stat and move pool editing, and a quest log to make sure you always know where to go. And if you ever get bored of your surroundings, you can always change the color palette of the overworld, as well as swap between an 8-bit and piano-styled soundtrack. But Dokimon has also received significant free updates since the last time I talked about it. This includes a new map with tons of trainers and items, and a few new routes and towns to explore, as well as an update to the existing world map and quest tracker, and of course, plenty of bug fixes. So if you're looking for a more retro monster taming experience with modern day features, then definitely check out Dokimon. Let's begin with a Pokemon fan game set long ago in the feudal era of the Pokemon universe, a time before even the existence of Pokemon trainers. In Pokemon Bushido, you'll instead play as the child of a royal samurai who is ready to receive their first Pokemon and become a Kenshi, which is basically this game's version of a Pokemon trainer. The story takes place in the region of Aisho, home to vibrant forests, rocky mountains, and cold oceans. The route designs are pretty good. While there aren't many of them, the ones you do explore are memorable and fun to progress through, and that's mostly thanks to the upgraded art style of the overworld. But there are a plethora of Pokemon to capture and build your team out of. You'll have access to Pokemon from the first 8 generations, but what really surprised me was just how many I could capture so early. I had a full team of unique but also useful Pokemon right from the get-go, and they're very easy to train, with the EXP handed to you very early, and items that replace HMs, so you don't have to worry about putting useless or unwanted moves on your precious team members. I did, however, find very little difficulty in any of the battles, but that also might not bother some people, and I'm sure you can find some challenge by choosing to play on set mode like I did, or even doing a Nuzlocke. But the most interesting aspect of Bushido would probably be the story, and the gimmicks it incorporates into it. On your journey throughout the region, your main task will be to challenge the 3 main clans of Grass, Fire, and Water, while also stopping an antagonist clan who wield Shadow Pokemon. I'll be honest, it's probably the best use of Shadow Pokemon I've seen in a fan game, and they're present all throughout the story, on top of feeling like an actual threat. Overall, Pokemon Bushido is a great game with a unique story, but it is only about 10 to 15 hours long, so keep that in mind before you jump into it. But maybe you're looking for something much more akin to the mainline games. So next up is a much more basic fan game called Pokemon Itinerant. Now, don't worry, because despite its simplicity, the game still has a ton of features many of you will enjoy. You'll travel through a brand new region put together using an enhanced Generation 3 tile set that keeps the nostalgic feeling of the older games while also offering a lot more visual appeal. The region is absolutely filled to the brim with Pokemon spanning across all 9 generations, and they're all incredibly easy to train thanks to the very early EXP and EXP candies available for sale in every Pokemon. But what really makes this game special is a feature that people have been asking for in fan games and ROM hacks since the release of Scarlet and Violet, and that would of course be terrestrialization, the ability to change your Pokemon's type into its Terra type. I'll be honest, while it is a cool feature on paper, in-game it does feel kind of lame, and I think that's mostly due to just how easy the battles are. I barely struggled with any fights, as the game gives you access to a variety of different Pokemon very early, and I even found myself to be overleveled for almost every fight. Not to mention the also very cheap full team heal option built right into your Pokegear. Going back to the start of the segment, you might be wondering what makes the game so simple, especially considering the number of features I just described. Well, I think it's mostly due to the story and region. The story pretty much just exists to exist. It has nothing of substance to offer, other than just to tell you where to go next. As for the region, while I do think the maps look nice, especially due to the upgraded tiles, they do feel very basic and quickly assembled. So, to be honest, this game wasn't very enjoyable for someone like me. But you also might not be someone like me, and might just want a new region with Generation 9 Pokemon, mechanics, and even terrestrialization. So if that's the case, then definitely try it out. But I know most of you come to Pokemon fan games in hopes of playing with an actual new story, not one that feels identical to the main series games, or barely exists at all. So let me introduce you to Pokemon Floral Tempest. Now, in terms of quality, this game is admittedly a bit of a mixed bag. So let's first talk about what's good. Your story will begin as an orphan child, who has now grown old enough to leave the orphanage and begin their Pokemon journey, hoping to find a place in the world. During your adventure, you'll meet plenty of different characters, ranging from friendly rivals to petty thieves, and many different antagonists. So the story is pretty good, but I do have to warn that it definitely is geared to a more mature audience. As for the region, it's put together nicely using a quite unique tile set that I even used myself in my own fan game a few years ago. So the world does look nice, and the routes are pretty fun to explore. My only nitpick is that the houses and other structures feel very big compared to the size of your character and other NPCs. Where the game really begins to fall off though, is the Pokemon battles. First of all, you'll begin the game by picking one of 4 difficulty modes. I went with normal, despite usually enjoying more of a challenge, and I'm kind of happy that I did, because the Pokemon variety was pretty bad, despite the game featuring the first 8 generations of Pokemon. So while I thought the normal mode was pretty balanced, I'm not sure how much fun the game would feel fighting stronger Pokemon with your incredibly weak ones. And finally, my biggest pet peeve with the game was probably just how bland the battle scene looked. A lot of move animations seemed to be missing, and a few Pokemon sprites looked very out of place. But if none of those issues bother you, and you just want a good story with a nice new region to explore, then I don't think it would hurt to try, as its main story is completed with all 12 gym badges and the Pokemon League the challenge. But I'm sure you're tired of stories that take you through a gym challenge and then the Pokemon League. So let me introduce you to a fan game that's very different from probably anything you've played before. This is Pokemon Salt and Shadow, and it labels itself as Pokemon meets Dark Souls. You won't begin your journey in a small town or city, rather underneath the ocean. And after choosing your starter, you'll then be transported to Cradle Island, where you'll learn that the world only has 13 days until it ends. The world of Salt and Shadow is a very unforgiving one. Your Pokemon will not gain any EXP from winning battles. While there are still ways to level them up, you will mostly be catching new ones each time you find yourself surrounded by stronger opponents than before. But even with such a pitiful rule, the world is completely non-linear. You can choose to go almost anywhere you'd like, with the only thing in your way being opponents with stronger Pokemon. Even the Champion's Throne sits right above the starting area, and while I'm not usually a fan of projects that use the default overworld tiles, Salt and Shadow doesn't do so to try and build a vibrant and diverse region, rather a much more depressing and hopeless one. But this game probably isn't for new or more casual players, as each time you fully heal your team, the Doomsday Clock ticks down, forcing you to really manage your resources. But if you're a longtime fan of the series, looking for something more unique and challenging, then definitely play Salt and Shadow. Now this last game is pretty interesting, and that's because it features 2 different stories in one game. This is Pokemon The First Journey, and it's a very plot-focused game that tells the story of a very early and underdeveloped Kanto region. you'll play as a much younger Professor Oak, who just recently graduated university and is now tasked with transforming this nearly lawless region into one that thrives on the business and career of Pokemon training. It's a good story that's told very well using character portraits and a ton of cutscenes. On the contrary, I think the overworld design held the game back from looking a lot better, as it's put together using tiles from various different art styles that just don't mesh well together. But even though the game takes place in a much older time period, it does thankfully come with a lot of modern quality of life features. First, all Pokemon evolve by level up, and many weaker ones have received updates to their move pools. But more importantly, you'll have access to the EXP All and a full encounter list available right in the pause menu. So building a full team will be very easy, and you'll be able to do so very quickly with just how many Pokemon there are. And despite this being based in Kanto, there are a ton of new areas, some being completely custom, and others inspired by cut content from the official games. But once you finish the main story, rather than continuing to a post-game, you'll begin a completely different one, taking place 50 years later. You'll play as Red, having just lost to the protagonist of the Generation 2 games, and are now tasked with traveling through Johto to track down a certain individual. Now, I don't want to spoil too much about the stories, but they're both really good, and have some really interesting twists. They're each around 10 hours long, so if you want something more short and sweet, then definitely check them out. But that's going to wrap up this video. I hope you found at least one new fan game to play, and if not, then make sure you check out the rest of the videos on my channel, and even subscribe for new ones. But anyways, have a nice rest of your day, and goodbye!